Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Adubato. I'm a professor of philosophy, host of the Cracks in Postmodernity platform, who is sponsoring this event. And on behalf of the New York Encounter, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's panel on youth and identity. So in his 2019 apostolic exhortation, Christus Vivit, Christ is alive, Pope Francis insists that young people are not meant to become discouraged. They are meant to dream great things, to seek vast horizons, to aim higher, to take on the world, to accept challenges, and to offer the best of themselves to the building of something better. That is why I constantly urge young people not to let themselves be robbed of hope. To each of them, I repeat, let no one despise your youth, he says, citing the first letter to Timothy. Our younger years are full of expectation and desire, an intuition that life is an adventure, that it is full of the promise of an ultimate fulfillment, and a hope for a brighter future. And yet, as we inch toward adulthood with its commitments, sacrifices, its obstacles and disappointments, we find that it's tempting to lose sight of that youthful vibrancy that once colored our days past. Some argue that today's younger generations are struggling in very particular ways, that we're facing unforeseen societal and emotional dilemmas that were unknown to previous generations. The numerous sociological studies and commentaries on trends among millennials, Generation Z, even Generation Alpha, which are those born after 2010, distinguish them from their elders, so commonly referred to as boomers and Gen X. So those such categorizations are incomprehensive and can't adequately give space to diversity experiences among those within the same age bracket. Certain commonalities are indeed noticeable, some of which have unsurprisingly drawn the public's attention and concern. So, for example, marriage rates have dropped from 47% in 1980 to 29% in 2015. The annual birth rate dropped from 70.9 births per 1,000 women in 1990 to 56 in 2022. The median cost of a down payment on a house was about 65% of the median income in the 1980s, whereas today it's 85%, making it very difficult for younger people to own property. The rate of nuns, or those who have no affiliation with religion whatsoever, among teenagers has jumped from 20% in the 90s to 32% today. And over 50% of millennials have been treated for clinical depression, and nearly 4,000 high school students die by suicide every day in the US. We invited Tara Isabella Burton and Father Patrick Gilger for discussion this afternoon about the transition that we all must go through from youth to adulthood, and to comment on the trends that they have observed amongst today's younger generations, both the unique challenges that we face, as well as the ways that we may bring hope to the rest of society. So Tara Isabella Burton is the author of the novels Social Creature, The World Cannot Give, and the recently published Here in Avalon, as well as the nonfiction books Strange Rights and Self-Made. She's currently working on a history of magic and modernity to be published by Convergent in late 2025. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the New York Times, National Geographic, Granta, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and many more. Father Patrick Gilger is a Jesuit priest and an assistant professor of sociology at Loyola University Chicago, and he's a consulting editor at America Media. A frequent public speaker and co-host of Think Like a Jesuit, Father Gilger is also an award-winning author whose writing has been published in Vox, La Civiltà Cattolica, Public Seminar, Church Life Journal, and America. So let's thank our guests for being here today. So I wanted to ask you guys, Tara, Father Patty, if you can start by telling us a little bit about your experience of transitioning from youth into young adulthood. So what were some of the desires, some of the hopes and expectations you had as a young person? And what were also some of the challenges and the fears that you faced going through that transition?
Stephen, it's really good to be here with you. Tara, Tara and I just met for the first time right backstage here, and I'm a huge admirer of your work, Tara, so I told her that I'm currently making my undergraduates in the sociology of religion class I'm teaching right now at Loyola read her book, Strange Rights. They were very excited that we were going to get to talk, so it's a pleasure to be here. I feel like I'm a strange case in answering that question of like how, what it was like for me to even imagine being an adult. When I was going to college, I was a pretty introverted person. In fact, my mom really encouraged me, almost pushed me to go away from home. Like, you need to move away to a college outside of this. So, but she also looked for a place, and my dad too, where I could kind of be at home. Like, so get out, but also a place that could, give me a little bit of a nest to enjoy. That place was Crate University in Omaha, Nebraska. So I don't know, like, getting out to Omaha is not really like the biggest thing. But what that place did for me was many things that were very important. But it kind of unlocked these desires that were inchoate in me, and then gave me a direction and a language and a community within which to consider pursuing them. That was the Jesuit community there. So I can look back now and say, like, if I'm asked to characterize, like, what's the fundamental trait that God has given me that either is a source of grace or a source of sinfulness in my own life, zeal is the answer to that. Like, I'm a zealous man, and the way that I make mistakes is to be overzealous. And I can see that even in my experience as a young person in university, where once I met the Jesuits there, I was like, that's what I want. And being a priest came secondary to that. I was just like, after that synthesis of openness to the world, relative normalcy, I say relative, right? Jesuit normalcy, intellectual rigor, attention and relationship with the poor, all of those things, I was like, that's the thing I want. And I went right after it. So, I'm not sure that that's what's happening with young people today, and I'm sure I caused no end of, tumult to my formators because of my zeal in this, but that's what it was like for me, at least, and I want more of that for the students I'm teaching today. I'll end just by saying this, that one of the things I say to my own students often, like on a Friday, when I'm teaching on a Friday, I'll say to them, what are you doing this weekend? And they'll be like, we're going to study, or we're going to do this, or blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no. Instead, go have, like, a little too much fun. Right? Not like way too much fun, right? But a little too much outside of your comfort zone. And then they kind of look at me, they're like, what? And I'm like, go, They need that little push now to get the zeal going in them.
So I too, I'm not sure if my answer to the question is sort of normative, because for me, the transition from youth to young adulthood is so bound up with my own conversion. So in my 20s, I had a very sort of stereotypical New York 20s, did a lot of Soul Cycle, was very into self-care, had a very particular image of what I wanted my life to be, what I thought I was entitled for my life to be, that I was going to sort of have all these exciting experiences and consume life. And I did think that I had a kind of consumer model for what life ought to be. And so I'm not sure what was maturity, what was conversion, what was a sort of radical shift. But for me, the realization that what I saw as the good life, or the life that I wanted to pursue as a slightly older and I hope more mature person, was one that was lived in community, and one that was lived towards a final end, which might require of me things that made me uncomfortable or put limits on my autonomy. And those are the sorts of things that I think are probably true more broadly of the transition to adulthood, but also I think specifically true of a shift in how I saw the world. And what's interesting to me now as I look, so I'm 33, I'm mid-millennial, I'm neither elder nor, I'm right in the middle of the millennial demographic. And what interests me about members of Generation Z and younger is the degree to which, because of, I think, the sort of anecdotal rise of interest, certainly in traditional forms of religion, but more broadly, I think there's a more intense sense on the part of young people that life ought to be lived towards a telos, that there are certain kinds of sacrifices that we ought to make in order to live well. And I think it's less true, perhaps, for a 21-year-old now in New York to kind of blithely enter the assumption, the sort of assumptions that, New York is a giant Sex and the City playground to be sort of danced around and experienced. I think that perhaps has had its moment, not finally, but its ascendancy as a cultural force is being challenged. And so when I speak to younger people, I'm often very, very struck that, at 23, 24, they're thinking seriously in ways that I did not think about until quite a bit later. So I think I'm curious about the degree to which the language of spiritual hunger, the language of telos, the language of a craving for presence are more culturally prevalent than they were when I was in my own 20s.
And I think what's interesting when we look at both of your transitions side by side is that they matured obviously as time went on. You came to understand what you really desired for your life. But you're also indicating that there was some kind of undergirding ideal that you were striving towards. There was some guiding principle that led you to where you are today. And I want to juxtapose this a little bit with the thesis of your most recent nonfiction book, Tara, Self-Made, which she'll be signing later on after this. But what you're doing in this book, it's really fascinating because you're kind of tracing the thread of this narrative of the self-made person, of self-making, starting from the beginning in the Enlightenment, going through the Romantic period, going up until today in the era of reality TV, of social media. And you highlight a lot of the positive elements of this narrative of the self-made person. That first of all, it liberated a lot of oppressed people who were not free to be themselves, who were never free to really express who they were to the depth of their being. Opened the door to a lot of artistic creativity. So you mentioned, for example, Frederick Douglass. You mentioned Andy Warhol as some positive iterations of this narrative. But then you also highlight some of the dangers. You show us how it could possibly lead us to this tendency towards hyper-artificiality, which we see a lot on social media, reality TV, as we said. You also see kind of disturbing forms of authoritarianism, of neo-fascism popping up. So you mentioned the Kardashians, you mentioned Mussolini. Not to say the Kardashians are fascists, but some might argue that point. But let's talk a little bit about this narrative of self-making. What are some of the triumphs that you see in the way that younger people are using it today, but what are some of the pitfalls as well?
So I think and in my book I talk about the self-making tradition as being a kind of fusion of this idea that we can kind of create ourselves economically, the idea of the self-made man or the self-made person in the entrepreneurial sense, and the person, the dandy, the celebrity who creates themselves as a work of art. I see them as two sides of the same coin. The idea that who we truly are, our most authentic selves, are to be found in the pursuits of our desires. Who we really are is who we want to be. And I think in the contemporary world, there's sort of one very particular way in which this is a potential avenue towards something good and real, and several ways in which it's not. So I'll start with the positive. I think at its best, the vision, what the myth of self-creation that we can make ourselves does is assert that we are not reducible to our biographical details, that the facts of our birth, of our race, of our gender, what have you, none of those fully define us, that who we are as individuals, that we have a particular dignity, a particular irreducibility and distinctness that cannot just be flattened into a list of things about us. And I think this is was true of the dandies of the 19th century, who were also in their own way responding to technological advances and industrialization and the idea that everything was being mass-produced around them. The dandies sought originality as a kind of political goal as well as an aesthetic one. And I think that vision is something that I never want to lose sight of, the idea that something about us when we attempt to disclose ourselves to another person is distinct. The problem for me lies is when we equate that distinctness, which we can think of theologically in a number of arguably better ways, with desire, with what we want, that our yearning to look a certain way or be a certain way or have certain qualities or have a certain bank account or a certain number of Instagram followers, that these are somehow more authentic iterations of ourselves than what we do not choose. And this is the part that I'm increasingly critical of and increasingly wary of, that somehow what we want is truer than what is thrust upon us by by society, by community, by social relationships, by responsibility. And that's something I very much want to push back against.
Yeah, and before we take it to Father Patty, I wanted to highlight that a lot of what influenced your work, as well as Father Patty's works, is the scholarship of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, very famous for his over 800-page book, A Secular Age, which I'm very proud of the fact that I finished reading in its entirety. It's quite the accomplishment. So other than A Secular Age, Taylor is known for his writing on this idea of the ethic of authenticity. So kind of, we see where this idea of the self-made person, the authentic person, the one who's true to themselves, comes in here. And there are a lot of critics, we can say, of secularism who have taken Taylor's narrative and used it to kind of expound on this doomsday, pessimistic view of what's going on in the world today, saying that, we've exchanged worship of God for worship of self. But when I read your works, when I talk to you both, for you it's a little bit more nuanced. You have a more measured take, at least in your engagement with Taylor. You don't think it's all doom and gloom. And I especially for you, Father Patty, because you're working with young people, both as a priest, as a spiritual director, but also as a professor working in the classroom. So I'm wondering, so when you see the way that they live this ethic of authenticity, trying to become their true selves, being who they really are, in what ways is that something liberating for them, but also how can it be limiting or burdensome to have to live up to this ideal of being my real self?
Oh, hi.
I'm also happy to have you answer, Tara.
No, go for it.
Thank you. I can just yell next time. I'll just go. So that's a great question, Stephen. Many things to say. Let me pick up on something that you were saying, Tara, that resonates with me about this idea of self-making, the opportunities and the limitations of self-making. So one of the things that we can notice and can see in there, I think, is that maybe this is just the part of the way the Society of Jesus, the Ignatian tradition, would put lenses on this, is that there are desires and there are desires. And I'll talk about that in the Ignatian way in just a second, but let me tell a story that might symbolize it here at the beginning. So I'm a sociologist, and I teach the sociology students at Loyola Chicago. None of you will be surprised, or I would bet you would not be surprised, that the sociology students are not always anticipating being taught by a Roman Catholic priest when they walk into the room, right? This is not a theology class, and so I walk in and they're like, who is this person, And so we get to know each other over the course of the semester. I wear my clerics, once or twice a week, to be with them and remind them of, what I stand for. But also, the things we're learning are social theory. That's what I teach them. I teach sociology of religion and theory and democracy, this kind of stuff. In the course of a social theory class I was teaching a couple years ago, a really great class, very talented students who were really open-minded, open-hearted. We built a great rapport with each other. We were reading the great sociologist George Simmel, some of you may know. He has this incredible essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life. And this is written like 100 years ago, more or less 100 years ago. And he's writing more or less about cities like Paris. And in this essay, his argument is that persons who move to the urban environment of like 1915, right, in Paris, are assaulted with all of these options for their lives. And 100 years ago, like you can't, this is pre-cable television, much less, like the internet. And the students reading this felt it really provocative for them, like provoking their hearts. And they were really responsive. So we had a great discussion about this, and at the end of it, I said, okay, you guys, I don't usually do this, but can I say one thing to you all about like what this might mean for your lives? And I said, may I? And they were like really open, like their eyes were bright, and they're like, yeah, trust enough in me. And I said, you're not going to like this. You've heard what living in this kind of a situation does to us. and how we can be tempted to withdraw into these pockets of, preferential communities, choice communities because of it. What I want to say to each of you is stop wearing your earbuds around campus. This is what you're doing, and you all hate it. And you just said to me out loud that you hate it. Stop it. And the room was like very silent for a moment. Because this is like, a challenge of their normal behaviors. And then they really took it in, 5 seconds, 7 seconds. And then this young woman in the back row, she's very talented, idiosyncratic, iconoclastic. She shoots her hand up. And before I can even call on her, she just goes, "Nope." Perfect, right? And then the whole room laughed, and we were very much together, and they had received the challenge. Maybe they changed their behavior, maybe not. And then I told them, well, look, you will never see me wearing mine around this campus. You will not. And what I was able to kind of pull out of them, right, is that in this conversation about George Simmel, they had talked about their desires, the dissatisfaction with the way that their lives were structured. And in my opinion and observation, and I think in their own observation of themselves, there was a sense that the dissatisfaction they had articulated was real. And at the same time, they were unwilling to change their behaviors. Most of them were, right? At that time. And those caveats are really important. And so we see there, I think, in that scene, the conflict, right, between the desires and the desires. I want it and I want it, I want it and I want it. And I think that's the dilemma of authenticity, right, that Taylor paints so beautifully in his book, The Ethics of Authenticity there. And the Jesuit way, the Ignatian way of distinguishing that, I'm going to try to go really quickly here, sorry you guys. The Jesuit way of distinguishing those two things is nuanced, but it's actually not that complicated. And if any of you get a chance to read Ignatius's autobiography, it can slip right by us when you're reading that quickly without noticing. Ignatius telling the story of his life. This is the story of his own conversion. He's been hit by the cannonball. He's carried back to his own castle. He's laying in bed. He's reading alternately. He wants these romance novels, but nobody has them. They won't give them to him, so he's reading these Lives of the Saints and the Gospels instead. And he said he would have these daydreams about like doing great heroic deeds, romantic stuff. And he liked that experience while he was imagining. And then he would read the Lives of the Saints or the Gospels, and he would like that while he was imagining, but he noted this was the difference. After he was done imagining his own life as a saint, the consolation he felt lasted. And when he was imagining great deeds, it did not last. The difference was time, was duration. That was how he was able to tell the difference between the desire and the desire. And so there are discernment tools that we have to cultivate, that the church can help us cultivate, but also that social theory can help us cultivate between the desires and desires without giving up on the promise of authenticity that I think you paint really well in your book, Tara.
Yeah, I'm uncertain about the idea of authenticity because I find, and I've been doing a lot of teaching on college campuses, and it is that word that comes up to be authentic as a goal, and I almost wonder whether the word is doing too much, whether sort of outside of Taylor's own definition in terms of what people mean colloquially, it's sort of something that is about truth, but is also about the conformity of something external to us to something in our interior state. And I think that our interior state is a very complicated place and a very paradoxical place. And
mine's very simple. I don't know about you. This is just I'm sure everybody
I wish that
out here.
were me. Oh, that sounds nice.
I'm obviously lying.
But I mean, even if we were to kind of conceive of what we want and think ourselves to be as a stable internal truth, assuming its stability, and thinking of authenticity as when our exterior worlds or actions or ways that other people perceive us conform to that interior state, I think it posits, that interior state is stable, that we have access to it, that we actually know what we want, that we know what we think. I mean, I find this constantly frustrating in accounts of either authenticity or desire as authoritative. Like, I don't know what I want most of the time. I think very few people do. I think there's most of the great literature of the world about people not knowing what they want. And so a question remains of, is there some truth that is interior to us, some reality that we are able to apprehend, to which our exterior lives and self-presentation ought to conform, a kind of truthfulness? And is that the same thing as popular authenticity, which seems to be about the sort of harmony of interior-exterior, where interior is only understood as desire or sense of self? And I think without a healthy suspicion of our own ability to apprehend our interior states, we make an idol of this one version of authenticity over and against a kind of more robust spiritual whole or truthfulness, our soul being in a good place, perhaps.
Very well said. And I would just say that the discernment between the different, I'm doing this, to give us a distinguishing pattern between the desires and the desires, or the version of authenticity and the version of authenticity. One of the things that, in addition to duration, that I think helps us distinguish them is friends, like community. So that, really it can be like my mother, or, can say to me, why are you acting like that? This is not you, right? She can call me to that, or my sisters can do that for me, or my best friend can say, hey, like, stop. That's not who you really want to be. And that, what it does is it kind of disrupts the connectivity that we often have kind of in our wider culture between authenticity and privacy. And I think that's a really important disruption to make. Yes, these are our desires. Yours here are intimate to you in a way that not even your wife or husband, right, can know. You cannot know them even of your firstborn child in this way. And they can be accompanied, right? We can talk about them and share them and dwell with them. And that is the best part of friendship and companionship in the world.
And one of the things that I find so striking, agreeing with you completely about this sort of question of authenticity, is simultaneously the irreducibility and the mystery, as you say, of it, that there is something about me that my husband or mother or perhaps one day child will not be able to access. And yet, at the same time, I think it is both a mystery, but it's sufficiently a mystery to ourselves that there are times when our friends, our loved ones, people in community are better placed to know us or reflect that truth than we are ourselves. Someone asked me at Self-Made's launch what the best antidote to bad modern self-making was, and at the time I said friendship. And I think most of us have had this phenomenon. If you haven't, I hope it happens to you, where you have a sense of yourself that is absolutely wrong, and you are just being dumb, and somebody that really loves you, that knows you, that has known you since before you started doing the dumb thing, says hey buddy, what's going on? This isn't you. This isn't right. This vision you have of yourself is wrong. And I think it's precisely in the fact that in our social relations, particularly with those that are predicated on trust and real knowledge, that sometimes other people have to tell us when we are not being ourselves. And it seems sort of paradoxical and beautiful to me that simultaneously there is some truth to me that even the most intimate relationships I have may not necessarily be able to access, and also that sometimes those intimate relationships are better able, or the people with whom I have an intimate relationship might be better placed to know me than I know myself.
I very much agree, and just want to offer a tiny anecdote. Sorry, Stephen. this is what happens when we just keep talking, especially when you get me here. I'm sorry. But yes, and an example of this that I really, to deepen, I hope, what you're describing there, Tara, is one of the things I love doing as a priest is doing marriage preparation with couples. And I don't get to do it as much as I used to when I was a pastor for a short time. But the reason I love it is because of exactly what you're describing. And I find that, yes, marriage rates are declining, right? And some of that is sad. But the persons who present themselves to the church for marriage these days, I just find them so admirable, like so fun, right? And I'm amazed and gratified by their generosity and like their deep desire, shared desire to be helped by someone. And the only thing that, I mean, I can help them do lots of little things, right? Like, I'm not sure you're really listening to each other well here, right? Did you really hear this? And did you hear this? And this kind of thing, sure. But the only real thing I can do is exactly this, is to let them know at a moment, once we've gotten comfortable with each other, that their love will not complete one another. And that what this marriage is not a sharing in a love that will make them complete, but a promise to be faithful to the lack of completion in the other person. And in fact, even more, that in the faithfulness to the incompletion in the other person's love for them is their own salvation, right? The friction that the insufficiency of the other person's love puts on their hearts is where God is saving them. And that's why marriage is a sacrament. It's salvific in that exact way. And so to say that to them from the very, the thing that we all do know, right? Like, romantic love will not complete you, right? Even though it's amazing. But that all the way through the sacramental articulation of it is such a gift. And really, this is my experience with the students that I teach when we talk about this authenticity, but also with the couples that I would work with. I was worried at first that when I would say something like that couples would be like, who is this guy? He doesn't know anything. Okay, and that's true. I may not know anything. But instead, their reaction is the exact opposite. It's like a relief where I can say, once I can say it to them, that they can then say it to each other, like, my love can't complete you. And that is like this moment of freedom in the midst of their promise of fidelity to each other that is like so fun to watch happen. And I'm like, no wonder I love doing this, right? Like, it's incredible to get to be with people in those kinds of moments.
Yeah, and what's really helpful in what both of you are saying, especially when you look at, again, Taylor's more pessimistic readers, this ethic of authenticity, first of all, sure, you can take it in this direction of like, I am who I say I am, whatever I feel in the moment. But you could also look at the fact that there is a certain set of needs, a certain set of desires and questions that are deeply rooted in my being that are not, they don't originate in myself, but they're given to me. And authenticity could be this. It could be really giving space for these desires, for these questions to flourish, to be explored. And this is the other piece of what you were both saying, is that it's in the context of a relationship that I really start to see these questions and desires emerge. It's when I look at somebody else that I start to see who I really am reflected back at me. But then I did want to bring up, Tara, you had a recent New York Times piece where you talked a lot about this quote-unquote therapy speak. And obviously we recognize that the fact that therapy, psychology is less stigmatized than it was in the past is ultimately a net positive. But one of the risks that you're highlighting in this piece is that this need for relationship, this need for unconditional commitments to others, whether it's in marriage, friendship, ecclesial communities, whatever it may be, we tend to use this therapy speak to protect ourselves from the risk implicated in living a commitment to somebody else. We tend to use the language of self-care, of boundaries, to kind of preserve our notion of freedom. But for a lot of us, it ends up kind of robbing us of our freedom. It ends up confining us a little bit more. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how sometimes we use this kind of language to protect ourselves from what ultimately can lead us to our true freedom, our true happiness. Yeah, it's on.
So I do want to draw a distinction between therapy and therapy speak, yeah, sure, of course. And I think one of the things that was very clear to me in the reporting I did for that New York Times article is just how many therapists hate therapy speak in the sort of popularized way. So I do want to be clear before I start criticizing therapy speak that I'm not criticizing the work done by therapists in therapy. But I think the normalization of kind of medicalized language that blends science and virtue ethics around the notion that who we are as human beings is predicated on the ways that we escape the demands that other people place on us is morally reprehensible. Not because we shouldn't have boundaries in the sense that when people treat us badly, we should not affirm our dignity to them, that we should not, in an ideal world where this is possible, speak honestly kind of against the kind of warped reality that quote-unquote toxic relationships create. But that ultimately the sort of service of the thing that it's all for ought to be, I think, a kind of communal vision of relationship where we're not talking about toxic people and boundaries, but we are talking about moral obligations we have to one another and not obligations, or that moral obligations we have to one another are what make us who we are. And if people's making demands upon us is seen as a source of distraction or repression from who we really are, if, the sort of, this is obviously a bit extreme, but the kind of, oh, your friend, the meme where your friend needs help and you ask, I can't hold space for you at the moment. What are you holding space for? Like, what is life for if not for other people, if not for not the collective as some abstract, but as we actually, the people in this room, are sustaining one another by virtue of the fact that we have obligations to one another. And I think one of the things that, I think there's a place for the figuring out who we are, again, as I said earlier in this panel, as irreducible beings, and a certain degree to which self-knowledge of our own irreducible self can make us wiser and better. But that's a very different thing from assuming that we can know ourselves if and only if we kind of cut out the dross of unpleasant obligation. And I worry, although perhaps the tides are turning, perhaps we've reached like peak therapy speak and now everybody thinks it's kind of cringe and we're over it now. I do think that so many of us, and I find myself thinking this, I don't think it's just a like secular phenomenon out there. I think all of us have in the back of our minds the sense like, well, I have to practice self-care. This is what I need. I have to figure out who I really am. And by assuming that we can figure out who we really are only in contrast to unpleasant social ties, we risk losing sight of what it means to be human.
Yeah, and Father Patty, you're in a very particular position because your vocation is ultimately, an imitation of the example of Christ. Like as a priest, you're here to give yourself to the church, but also the fact that you're a Jesuit, that you live in a religious community, ties, obligations to other people, sometimes people who are not very pleasant, because not all Jesuits are that great.
All Jesuits are pleasant.
So self-care for a priest, I don't know, what does this look like for you? Like, what does it mean to confront the fact that sometimes you're given people who are difficult, who aren't always easy to deal with, but it's your vocation to kind of minister and give yourself to them?
Yeah, no, that can be a difficult thing. It can be, but I'll find that looking at human beings by asking the question to Jesus, really, not rhetorically asking the question, not to myself, right? At least to another, if not to Jesus, at least to another person. How can I love this person? How can I love this human being who's in front of me? Sometimes it's still really hard, Right? But beginning from that stance of a desire to love opens up all of these possibilities for mutual understanding or understanding idiosyncratic and or annoying behavior that happens all around us, which of course would never happen in a religious community, as I'm sure you would all trust. But let me say a couple things, about that. Is that there are many jokes about. There are 1,000 jokes about the Jesuits. I will not even tell many of them. But one of them, you can say is that, when you've met one Jesuit, it's like you met one person, you've met them all. No, like when you've met one Jesuit, you've met one Jesuit. And in some ways, like there's no uniformity, right, to us. And despite the irony of us supposedly, being the ones who inhabit the long black line and that kind of thing. Now, that can be problematic, right? Maybe we haven't been internally disciplined by the spiritual exercises or our formation as much as we ought to have been. But it can also be an exact product of this same kind of disciplining process that happens in our formation. And we can become beautifully different from one another. And that experience of living with men who are really different from me, ecclesiologically different, politically different, ethnically different, ideologically different, is, I find, like a real joy. One of the small examples of it, at Loyola, this is a place where we do some of the philosophy training for our young men who are studying to be priests. So they live there for 2 or 3 years studying, philosophy and theology and whatnot, working and ministering as well. And I get to live with them, but in the house, in that same community, are always 1 or 2 older men, and that's a fantastic thing. And I do not count as an older man, despite the gray in my beard. That means we'll have men in their 80s living with men in their 20s, and that the tension that they put on one another is fantastic to watch, as they, over dinner or over drinks or in their preferred liturgical practices, fight out the tension in loving ways most of the time about how those kinds of things can be reconciled.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to something we were talking about at lunch. Something that you said you see in the classroom, Father Patty, is that a lot of the times, especially among younger students, there's this sense that they need to tiptoe around certain sensitive issues for fear of offending or hurting a fellow classmate. But also there's this anxiety about being offended myself. Like I don't want to be hurt, especially in a public setting. And I think this raises an important question about, as you're saying, life in a community, you want to be charitable. You want to be attentive to the needs of the person in front of me. But again, what if that person is very different from me, whether it's their age, they come from a different background, they have different beliefs than me. My fear is that if we put too much emphasis on not wanting to offend, not wanting to hurt, we don't have any real dialogue. We don't actually arrive anywhere. We're not real with each other. We don't achieve any new discoveries or new thought. So I'm wondering if either of you can comment on this phenomenon of, again, like being mindful of the other person's feelings, wanting to be considerate of their background, their history, but also actually wanting to discover something together, which sometimes requires clashing, sometimes requires disagreement.
Yeah, can I start, Tara? So one of the things that your earlier statement was kind of, bringing up in me is, okay, I have kind of complicated, political beliefs around like political liberalism. Like I have some interesting, whatever perspectives on that. But I only bring that up to be able to say that like some of the way we frame this question is like a classic liberal question. What I mean by that is that it begins from a stance where we are all autonomous individuals that ought not impose upon one another. And I think when we begin from that kind of like ontological, anthropological stance, that we have nothing to do with one another really, and if we do have something to do with one another, it's because we've voluntarily chosen to do so, right? It's like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, like we've made a contract, and now because of our contract that we've signed, right, my voluntary signing of this thing, now we can get along with one another in X or Y or Z way, but I don't have to deal with you in any other way. And I think when we begin from that kind of assumption of this is what reality is, we've just begun upside down. And I think that's the thing that needs to be challenged in ourselves, because look, like we all live in a version of modernity that puts that expectation on our hearts in serious ways. I think often in spiritual direction with people, that's one of the things that needs to be brought to God, that they need to bring up, is those top level desires end up looking like that. Like, well, this is what I think I want, right? And is it? Does it endure? Is it what brings you to freedom and fullness? That kind of stuff. Often, and then eventually people can say, no, it's not, right? But that presumption, it needs to be recognized and challenged. And I think that kind of brings back to some of those realities. Like in the classroom, if students begin from this sense that this is my classmate, but really, I don't have anything to do with you, and I'm just going to get my tablet or my laptop out, and I'm just going to take my notes with my headphones in, and you're right there, and we're really not here next to one another. It's like they're in a classroom like they're riding the F train right here in the city, right? Like, it's awful. It's awful. That's not a companionship. And there can be, though, in the classroom, a real overcoming of that. And what I find I have to do is model that overcoming and treat them in ways that disrupt that the individual, autonomous, classical liberal perspective of what it means to be a human being. And I do that in really just by being a little more vulnerable, or appropriately a lot more vulnerable. And so I will, when teaching like Sociology 101 or teaching Sociology 145, my Sociology of Religion class, I just tell stories. Like I'll often start with like stories about myself or about the world around me, and then say from there that are self-revelatory. I tell them about my mother. I tell them about my sisters. I tell them about my best friend or mistakes that I've made. I do the same thing in my preaching. One of the things, the keys for that, and I'll end with this, is that can also be a kind of narcissistic or self-centered act, to tell the stories about yourself. And you all know priests who do that, and I'm sure I have done it at times. And I think, though, in the time we live in, the task, I don't know another way to do this. I think the task is that I have to interrupt, I have to become the center of attention, and then get out of the way. Like I have to step right into the spotlight and then become fully hollow. So like in my preaching or in my teaching that way, I must have your attention. I'll tell you this story, and it's a little vulnerable, and then you, or these ideas from there, and then just, so I'm not looking for something from it, but opening it up for them, because they are the interesting ones.
Do I have time? Can I say something?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think that we can bandy, or within the conversations about sort of liberalism, such a loaded term, I think there's a very particular vision of the liberal public square that I think is one that I want to preserve as we talk about whether we're talking about a classroom or a political community, as we're talking about working out in community of different people how the answers to questions. I think at its best, the liberal public square offers a vision of epistemic humility. We know that we cannot know perfectly everything, and how can we, and we are wagering that the best way to get closer to the truth is through some kind of political dialogue. So how do we foster the kind of political dialogue that might get us closer to the truth? And I think that stance, and perhaps it's only a difference of emphasis rather than a kind of difference in kind, is very different from, well, there's no such thing as truth, everyone has their own truth, and we're just going to kind of cede the square to everyone's own marketplace of ideas. I'd say, like, in a sense, it is almost more like a university than a marketplace, that the classroom becomes actually the model of what a political community ought to be, a place where there are ways that conversations can happen to the best of human ability. And then I think the question comes, particularly when we talk about the classroom in 2024. Oh God, it's 2024. Gosh. And I kind of am allergic to talking about cancel culture, so I'm going to try and answer without talking about that. But I think two things can be true, and one is that all of us come to any question from a limited perspective, a perspective that is grounded in ideological priors, which may or may not to be grounded in biographical detail, and to overlook the fact that perspective is real and meaningful, that our experiences are not interchangeable, is part of
what it means to have a dialogue. At the same time, if we assume that there is nothing translatable or universal but iterating in different ways, we lose the possibility of the assumption that the classroom itself is a kind of political community. The political community is not something that I share with some people over here and you share with some people over there, and we're kind of representatives of these different communities coming in this neutral space. The space that we are in is also an additional community of which we are a part. And it's precisely, I think, in finding that balance, and I'm an Episcopalian, I'm just a moderate about everything, but being able to hold at the same time the notion that there is a way that an individual apprehends truth that is specific to them and their experience, and that ought to be treated with care and dignity, and also that through this kind of difference, however it looks, we are still capable of entering in community together. You have to uphold both, or the classroom doesn't work, and if the classroom doesn't work, politics doesn't work.
Yeah, and just to kind of bring everything all together, I want to talk about this issue of belonging and community and the struggle, the pain of isolation, the pain of loneliness that a lot of people experience. And Father Patty, in some other talks that you've given, you mentioned that I think in the UK now there's a minister of loneliness who's somebody in the government whose actual job is to address the fact that so many people are lonely. You've mentioned also that there are university administrators whose job is to foster a sense of belonging, to combat the isolation and loneliness students feel on campus. And you've also cited that the main populations that experience this loneliness most intensely are the youngest and the oldest, the elderly. And it's interesting to me because, you know, there's all this talk about how Gen Z, millennials versus the boomers, Gen X, they're different, these clashing views of culture, of society. But the reality is there's so many things, so many deeply human experiences, universal experiences that unite us. And I wanted to mention someone who I often bring up at these kinds of talks. You know, Dorothy Day, her autobiography, The Long Loneliness, is centered around this universal human experience of isolation, that basically she's saying no other human being, no possession, not even ourselves, can totally fill in that lack. Ultimately, it's a relationship with the transcendent, with the Creator, that can respond to this. Yet paradoxically, God answers that need through community. So it's not so much that the community members fix my loneliness or erase it, but it's that through sharing my loneliness with them, through accompanying each other with this lack, we come to recognize that there is someone who responds to this. There is a kind of love that transcends and unites all of us. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the value of intergenerational dialogue. So again, we see all the ways that the generations may be different, they have different experiences growing up, but how might we benefit from hearing from each other, hearing from people who are older than us, people that are younger than us? What gifts might we have to offer each other?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important question. It's one that I'm sure you all know Pope Francis has been returning to lately, where he's been encouraging young people to pay attention to the elderly, to not forget them. And I would love to see, you know, one of the things I would love to do if I taught high school, maybe I should just try at the university setting anyway, is to bring students like to a retirement home. And just to have them go visit, you know, just go be there and make friends with the people who are in the retirement home. And like, there's no rules against this. Like you can just go in, you know, like you don't have to have a form signed or anything like that. I think that's a real need. You know, one word about so, you know, we all know that in major institutions now, and which has been a large positive, a real net positive, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, I think are important and necessary in all kinds of our institutions today. So although I'm a critic of some of the ways that DEI has been cashed out, I'm also a really huge fan and supporter of the recognition of the need for this. But it's ironic that belonging is kind of getting like tucked on to this project of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So now it's like DEIB at many institutions and in fact many universities. So what's positive about that? What's positive is that these institutions are recognizing a problem. that those that they are there to serve do not feel included in the institutional project. That's great, but I'm not sure that you can solve that problem through legislation or programming. I think the only way that kind of problem gets solved is by accompaniment, like by friendship, by spending time. So at Loyola, for example, the people that I want to celebrate, the faculty and staff members that I really want to celebrate, are those who, yes, they do their job, but they don't just spend more time with them, with students as opposed to at home, but they include the students in their home lives. Like we have a couple faculty members who are wonderful, relatively young, late 30s Catholics. I think they have 6 kids now. And they're both philosophy professors. I have no idea how they do this. I can barely do it as a celibate man, like all this. But the wife of the family, she will often, once a month, bring her older children to one of the student 9 p.m. masses during the week at the Jesuit community. So we host the students over there regularly for mass and a thing afterwards. And she'll bring her kids who can stay up. It's on a Thursday night, so she's like, they only have 1 day left in school. They can go tired tomorrow. It'll be okay. And it's fun for them. So that's what belonging really is, like this kind of inclusion. And the students, because they get to be in contact with her children, feel like they belong at the university more. And so do the kids. They get to show up there and they're like, oh yeah, we know Loyola, we know this building, and we know so-and-so, and we know these students. Now it's a community, not just an institution where people pass into and out of, amorphously in the night.
Tara, do you want to comment on the...
I mean, when I think that the idea that family life, intellectual life, and quote-unquote professional life are inseparable from one another is ideal for a community, and particularly like an academic community. I'm thinking also like one of my favorite things I do every other year, hopefully every year, if they do that, if whoever has the power to do this, is the Plow Writers Weekend, which takes place at Fox Hill, where it's the Plow is a magazine run by the Bruderhof, an Anabaptist religious community who kind of have all property in common, and they host this incredible weekend for writers for the magazine that basically they also encourage families to come. So members of the Bruderhof will provide childcare. I want to say there was a pony last year.
There was.
There was something about watching someone like give a talk on, the future of liberalism, and their baby is like screaming like "Mom" in the background.
Yeah.
Like, not now, like mommy's talking about liberalism, but the kids are all really well behaved in a way, but precisely because we could talk about the practicalities, like it is easier for parents when they can bring their children to conferences, but more broadly, I think the implication isn't just let's make this easier on writers with children. It's also, the stuff we're talking about isn't this abstract ideology that ought to be cloistered. We are talking about life, and life ought to be let in to philosophical inquiry.
So just to, yes, you can go ahead and clap, yes. Go for it. And just to kind of bring everything back together before we close, this question of how do we maintain that vibrancy, that hopefulness of youth. Some of you may have seen the exhibit we're offering upstairs on the life of Simone Weil. And her most famous book, The Need for Roots, I think kind of speaks to this, that it's in the context of belonging, the context of community, family, where I'm connected to people who are different from me, different personality-wise, different age-wise, generationally, that my desire, my hopefulness, even amidst the obstacles, the sufferings that life comes with, is maintained. So before we have the announcements, as we do at all Cracks and Postmodernity events, we like to have a little bit of fellowship, so we welcome everyone in the room back there. We have some refreshments. We invite you to make conversation, to discuss some of the ideas that were shared on the stage today. And Tara will also be available in the main area where the books are being sold to sign copies of Self-Made.
Buy her book.
Please
it's really
do.
good.
It's definitely worth it. And we thank you all for attending.